So, Paul VanderKlay and Nate Hile, welcome to the least auspicious YouTube channel of the three of us, morning talk show.
Least auspicious?
Anyway.
Do any of us have an auspicious channel?
I don't know. I feel extremely humble in the presence of the two of you. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. This is a conversation.
You're a great interviewer. Give yourself more credit.
Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. This is a conversation between three people. I've met Paul a couple of times virtually before. I have not met Nate face to face personally, but we have had quite a lot of Twitter interaction. And so this is kind of one of those Paul's this little corner of the internet conversations, I suppose, which I have a lot of warm thoughts and feelings toward the two of you. And we were chatting the other day on Twitter, and a theme for myself and Nate in different ways seems to be the theme of hell and where it sits in the faith, what it is, what the Bible actually says about hell. So this is going to be a pretty Christian conversation. I'm just noticing I have Mother Goose tails in the background, so I'll get that off the screen so that it doesn't distract anyone. And so I actually thought,
we know that you read to your kids, so you're probably not going to hell.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, gret. Okay, well, that's
what it takes.
Yeah, I guess we'll just wrap this up then. So thank you very much. No. So what I was thinking for structure here, and maybe I'm just jumping into things too quickly, but what I was thinking for structure, when I first mentioned this on Twitter, it was kind of a Hail Mary thing where I was like, oh, it seems like the three of us are interested in this. And I've always wanted to have a 3-person conversation. Maybe this is the time. And for some reason it materialized. But then as I thought about it, I thought we, as 3 people, we actually have a really interesting diversity on this topic from what I know. And you can both correct me if I'm wrong. Nate's given a fair bit of time to hell and theologies of hell from Bulgakov and people like that. And Paul has, no offense, not talked about hell very much, but has talked about being a Calvinist. And so I think a lot of us are quite curious what your thoughts might actually be on the subject. And then me, I will just give a brief bit of hell biography, my biography of my narrative of hell in my life. So and then I was thinking Paul could respond to that, and then I was thinking Nate could respond to that because he'll have some interesting thoughts, I'm sure. So for me, I'm in a very unusual position, which might not be unusual at all. It might just be that people don't speak it aloud very often, which was that about 4 years ago, I just realized that I didn't believe in hell, that I did not think I was going to hell, or that anyone was going to hell, or that hell was real. But the reason I say I realized was because I was raised fire and brimstone. My father was and is a Baptist minister, and hell was terrifying to me, obviously, clearly, because, and sorry, when I say hell, I mean the Baptist hell of eternal conscious torment that I was taught about, that when we die, if we are not believers, if we have not believed in the Lord Jesus Christ and that he was crucified, died, and rose again on the 3rd day, that we will spend the rest of our lives with our flesh being burnt off, or not the rest of our lives, the rest of eternity, with our flesh being burnt off and seemingly regenerated and burnt off again, whatever the worst thing you can possibly imagine is. So I had a big crisis.
So it's okay. It's actually it's actually Aquinas' fault.
Oh,
so
okay. Well, okay.
The Catholics, that'll keep us all safe.
Yeah, right. Except for on Twitter, yeesh. So
there's no safety on Twitter.
Yeah. So anyway, a few years ago, I actually felt very paradoxically, for me, called into ministry, and I did a couple of years of church ministry in music, in the area of worship leading, as they called it, in my church at the time. And I felt very called, and in a weird way protected to do that. It felt like a very spiritual move, and a very, I don't know, I felt God's protection in it in a way that was unusual for me. And yet it was the unraveling of everything for me. It was the unraveling of faith. And it was during this time that after I left, that I was just trying to get my head straight. And I just had this realization: I don't believe in hell. But it feels unusual because it wasn't a theological choice, and it wasn't something that I even defend to anyone else. I don't try and tell people. I mean, I've started to a little bit, because I'm kind of offended by the way hell is discussed, but I don't. It didn't come from this place of like, oh, now I've seen the light. It came from, oh my goodness, I don't actually believe in this. And so, in this conversation, I would like to maybe find some nuggets and some interesting ideas from you two about hell, and about how thinking about hell and versions of hell could be actually edifying in my life. I almost want to build hell back into my consciousness, but in a way that I can live with, in a way that's livable, and that I can understand. You know, all the other parts of my faith have kind of come back online as I've been, being rebuilt, I think, by the Holy Spirit. They've kind of come back online. Hell has not done that. And that's I don't want to maximize our time. So Paul, if you have thoughts on hell or a response to what I've said, there's no structure here, but I guess this will be the most formal part, is I'll ask you to go next, and we'll go from there.
Well, I don't know. I've actually been thinking about this conversation for a while, because, as you noted, I do not talk very much about hell. There, in the New Testament, there's really Gehenna and Hades. In the Old Testament, there's Sheol. So just on that level, hell is sort of a theological construct, usually something of Hades and Gehenna put together. But then also, I'm working this week on Matthew 25, and if you read Jesus, so to read Matthew 25, I was reading Matthew 24, and I was just struck by how unapocalyptic a lot of the contemporary Jesus is compared to the Jesus that you find in the Gospels. The Jesus in the Gospels is very apocalyptic. And for example, at the end of chapter 24, who then is the wise and faithful servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants of his household to give their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drink with drunkards. The master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at that hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's in the Bible. It doesn't say hell. It doesn't say Gehenna, although, Jesus will talk about Gehenna, and the rich man who pays no attention to poor Lazarus will find himself in a very uncomfortable part of Hades. So I am not a skeptic about God's judgment but part of what I think we're wrestling with is, how do we talk about these things now? And I don't mean that in sort of a mid-20th century demythologized sense. I'm not Bultmann. So it's a very fair conversation. I'm not skeptical about a final judgment. I'm not skeptical about God's evaluation of me. And in fact, there are times when I think about God's evaluation of me that it's not so comfortable. Yet I've not really been a person who spends a lot of time or ministry focus on the kinds of narratives that you just explained, which are very common in American evangelicalism. Yeah, I'm not hostile to those narratives either, because I think those narratives express something certainly something very historical about Western Christianity, but I think those narratives, it's fair to talk about those things. And the difficulty is that I know how what I just said will sound to certain people who are patrolling certain borders, and they will say things like, well, Paul VanderKlay must be, and then this other thing that they don't want to be. But I think, as a Protestant, when you read these kinds of things that Jesus says, I think you have to pause and ask, well, what's he talking about here? Because he says this kind of thing a lot, especially in the parables in Matthew. You've got turning servants over to be tortured until they pay back all they owe. You've got outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth and the wedding banquet. So on one hand, I think you have to read these pet texts, and I think you have to pay attention to the apocalyptic Christ and wrestle with what this means for each of us.
Nice. Yeah, and I have found it interesting that you haven't been on this topic a ton. I sometimes wonder if people who don't preach hell very often are maybe having the same kind of intuitions deep inside that led to my realization. But I also don't want to put that on you. But I hear what you're saying. I enjoy the idea of being quite serious about the scarier side of God's judgment, and because the Bible, like you say, it's definitely there. You have to, I would like to have a seriousness about the depravity of people, just as I'd like to have a seriousness about our desire for God and our theoretically our goodness. So yeah, Nate, you're up there. A lot to respond to, I guess.
So yeah, I would agree that, I mean, this is what we have to make sense of, is that the scriptures both have this language about judgment, and they also contain language that clearly points toward a universal reconciliation. And these things so the challenge is to understand how we can affirm both of these things to be true. That's my perspective. In terms of like my own, like I'm what you would call a natural universalist. I didn't have to be like I didn't have to be persuaded that everyone would eventually be reconciled to God. But at the same time, I also affirm hell and judgment. I just think that they cannot be eternal. And there are lots and lots of like technical arguments that I could get into as to why that's a valid position. But I just wanted to take the time first to make it very, very clear that I do affirm hell and judgment. But I think God's justice has to be restorative. And if God's justice is not restorative, then I don't know what kind of God you're talking about. And in terms of what, like, the kind of belief in hell that you're talking about,
Me?
in terms of how that you were talking about when you were telling your story, in terms of the way that impacted my life, is that it made it very difficult for me to call myself a Christian for a long time. And because the only kind of Christianity I knew was similar to what you were raised with. So it took a very long time for me to have the confidence to say, no, I take Jesus just as seriously as you do, and I am a Christian. And what caused that for me was when I was very young, my favorite person in the entire world was my grandfather. My grandfather was a retired chef. He was from Oklahoma City. He was not a super educated person. And he was a person who was colorful with his language and not a church person, but he was one of the best people I've ever known. And I can say that without hesitation. I would also point to the fact that one of the things we have to also, if we're going to quote Matthew 25, the other thing we have to take serious about Matthew 25 is that Jesus doesn't seem to care very much at all about what people believed in Matthew 25. He seems to have cared about what they did, not what they believed. So I actually don't really, I actually have almost as much loathing for this topic as Paul does, to be honest with you, because it's not something that I like to debate.
Yeah.
And I know all the arguments, but it's not something that I enjoy debating. So yeah, I've just always been a universalist. And it took a long time for me to accept that it was okay to be a universalist and a Christian. And that's what my hang up was. It took me a long time to get there. And I had to discover the patristic tradition of universalism that is quite obvious and very robust and not limited to Origen, but limited to many figures in the early church, but it includes many figures in the early church. So,
yeah, I love the inclusion of kind of some personal biography in this conversation, like talking about your grandfather and that kind of thing. Who sounds, I like him already, and it's kind of one of those things that does inform people's at least feelings on hell and universalism. Is that you just know these people, like if a God could send this person to hell, then I'm kind of with you on that. Like I don't think I could be a Christian. So, but yeah, so I can assure you that this won't be a debate, as we've already kind of discussed. So, and I know that it is one of those things that's uncomfortable to talk about. And I think it's going to become something that we have to talk about a little bit, at least, because as Paul has experienced, there's been, and as we've all experienced, there's been this kind of reignition of interest in Christianity through Jordan Peterson several years ago, that has led people to, a lot of people, like I picture people wandering into Paul's church with sort of like a dazed look in their eye, like never thought they would.
That's how they leave.
Yeah. Yeah. Jordan Peterson has like done something to their brain where all of a sudden they feel there's at least philosophical benefit, and that the biblical stories are actually kind of baked into our minds, and they're warmed. I even had a friend who a couple of years ago now, took me out for a coffee to basically tell me, how I've made fun of you being a Christian? Well, I now don't think it's stupid to be a Christian anymore. Like this was he didn't become a Christian, but and he still isn't. And he's like your grandfather. He's one of the best people. But he just wanted to tell me, like, I used to think you were stupid for believing, and now I don't. I'm like, thank you. But anyway, I think it's kind of this thing. It's going to be this big matzo ball hanging out or whatever, like as people are warming, we're seeing all of this kind of re-enchantment. People are desperate for re-enchantment and finding all kinds of different spiritual paths. And hell's going to be something we need to talk about. So I kind of want to know how to talk about it. In my another thing I was going to say is, Nate, you were saying it made, the hell that you were taught as a child made it difficult for you to call yourself a Christian. I had kind of a scrambled version of that same experience where it wasn't difficult for me to call myself a Christian, and I wasn't even skeptical about hell, but hell made it hard for me to take time with the rest of the gospel, like with the rest of salvation. It's sort of like, if you were to personify all the different, redemption and communion and all these things, and they were all sitting together in a group, hell would be this snarling dragon demon in the corner. And as I wanted to have a conversation with this,
there's a tendency for the objective of the Christian life to become not going to hell.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a tendency to tell people that their salvation is in doubt. That's something that's been told to me a million times. When was the last time that you knew that you were saved? Or I had a friend send me a YouTube channel that was a guy casting demons out of long-time happy, faithful Christians, and we're always under attack. We're always afraid that we might be actually going to hell. And I fell right into that.
So you won't hurt my feelings by doubting my salvation. Like that's like the thing. I think the one person whose salvation it is healthy for you to doubt is your own.
Right.
If you want to make Nate angry, question the salvation of somebody I love.
Yeah.
Right.
That'll get me mad.
Right.
I think one of the early things that happened with me is I like you, if you listen to certain kinds of Christians in certain kind of places, so this is pervasive. I mean, this comes to us from medieval Catholicism too. So when I started reading the Bible for myself, I very quickly began to realize the Bible is the story of heaven and earth, not heaven and hell.
Yeah.
And so once that move shifts, you then have, and then the Bible is about the reconciliation of heaven and earth. But then you still have the problem of how does God handle rebellion? And when and where and how is that rebellion resolved? And, Nate mentioned, universal reconciliation, let's say. I was, in my Sunday school course on Romans, I picked up this book, which is a real fun book on the history of interpretation of Romans. And they had this lovely chart and, universal salvation, Origin, J.W. Coleman, Schleiermacher, J.A.T. Robinson, Reverent Agnosticism, Clement of Alexandria, Maximus the Confessor, Karl Barth, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Richard John Neuhaus, Annihilation of Unrepentant, John Stott, Eternal Punishment of Unrepentant, Augustine, Luther, Calvin. Now you can point and maybe quibble and get some higher definition on these little categories, but this conversation about how the relationship between God finally resolving our existence with our rebellion in the course of what history, where and when and how. This is a very long conversation in the Christian story and doesn't quite the Bible, like many, many other things, including, let's say, the Trinity, which, even when I went to seminary, at my seminary, they said, well, the doctrine of the Trinity is in the Bible in solution. The conversation of the church continues to carry on with respect to these themes. But again, if you just stop and recognize that, even as Protestants, if you're saying, okay, the Bible is the sandbox from which we are going to build these things, or at least our foundation, you have to see that the Bible is the story of heaven and earth, not heaven and hell. And once you make that shift, the rest of the conversation can sort of be had then with respect to these other pieces, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's true, as long as, I like that a lot. I guess it doesn't necessarily remove my terror.
You should be. I mean, Nate said it very well. We should all be. I mean, when we think about facing God with what we've done, and Nate is exactly right. The New Testament doesn't judge us on our thinky-talky. The New Testament judges us on our actions, because actually those really show what we believe in many respects. We should be deadly serious about facing God and his judgment of us. That's not going to pull that.
I also believe most people are going to hell, by the way. I just don't think that. I don't think it's eternal. I think that's bad Greek.
So you would be like, that brings me to George MacDonald, because that was one of the kind of
yeah, MacDonald is not soft on judgment at all. Not
exactly.
even remotely.
I stumbled into MacDonald during this period, and I honestly didn't even realize a bunch of you people were into George MacDonald and the Common Toad Matt. I was just chatting with him online. He mentioned George MacDonald, and I lost my mind. I was like, I felt like I was the only person, because no one was talking about that in my life. And George MacDonald has these visions of the rose of fire, this pain, this consuming, cleansing, painful thing. And in the Princess and Curdie books, there's the burning away, and in especially it gives a lot of ink to it in Lilith, which really hit me like a ton of bricks in the redemption of Lilith, and when she's given and she's just the personification of evil, and she's given all these opportunities, and then is punished. And so anyway, that really impacted me. I haven't read pretty much anybody that you listed on your list, Paul, but I have read George MacDonald. And so, yeah, that got me thinking that the other thing I noticed, though, at the same time, was that George MacDonald was as serious in describing goodness, the ways that we can participate and embody. I don't want to say that we are good, because I don't think we're good or bad, but I notice a seriousness in the way that he approached goodness. And I've heard C.S. Lewis say that if somebody isn't serious, because I was looking up heaven, and C.S. Lewis says if somebody isn't serious about heaven, they don't tend to be serious about hell either. And I thought, I don't know, I would like to be serious about our goodness and our badness. I don't know if I'm stimulating anything there in what I'm saying, Nate, or do you have anything?
Well, I would kind of agree with Paul that that it's a story of heaven and earth. So the story, so I don't really, I'd have to know the context of Lewis's remark there.
Right, of course.
But I think heaven is in some way is oriented toward the future, I would say. But it has to be, but the way the story ends is the union of heaven and earth. It's not just escape to heaven.
Right. Yeah. Which is how how that was described to me.
Well, part of what happens in the history of secularity, post-Enlightenment, this strange time that we're living in, the pervasive assumption in the cultural imagination, which goes far beyond Christianity, that we outlive our physical deaths in some way, that sort of gets truncated. And that, I think for many people, that was the death of both heaven and hell in the inherited Christianity that many received in the West, which led to this weird reality in our culture where heaven and, maybe there's sort of a haunted existence where good people get good things when they die, and Mao, Hitler, Stalin, and pedophiles, and the neighbor that plays music late at night, they go to hell. That's kind of what happened in our culture. And I think part of the difficulty was also that sort of squishing of our world into this birth to death also distorted a bunch of things. So now suddenly we don't quite know how to talk about people who ravage the earth. And for all of the discussion about justice, Miroslav Volf in his book, I forget which book it was, but it was one that I read years ago. He dives into a lot of these issues, and he notes that part of what happened in at least the communist era, which was, again, ostensibly atheist, was that all narratives had to achieve their realization within this frame, which meant a heightening of utopianism, but also a heightening of bloodshed, like in the breakdown of Yugoslavia. Suddenly, if your enemies needed to be punished, they were going to have to be punished by getting blood on your militia's hands. And there's a lot of distortion that happened in the 20th century in these frames. And I think we're getting to the point now that we're beginning to realize that that whole narrative world doesn't work very well, because I've said many times, when you try to bring heaven down to earth, you usually bring hell up to earth too. And even the new group of people who are sort of coming in because of Jordan Peterson has a fairly realized eschatology in that, it's all sort of in the secular box as well, because of some of his decisions to be a little bit agnostic about what's beyond it. So there's a good reason why there's a lot of people who are experiencing the kinds of things that you talked about.
Yeah. So I'm taking it that the two of you would not at all be in the camp of people who believe that hell is something we experience here on earth, and that heaven is something we can bring into, that the kingdom of heaven is something we bring onto earth, and that there's something.
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, same here, Paul.
Yeah. So
you just don't want to make that the entire story.
Right. I was going to say, I wasn't actually going to end there because that's kind of where I was at a certain point. But it seems to me that reality has that fractal nature where there is something maybe analogous to hell on earth, and something analogous to heaven, and something and glimmers of the kingdom of heaven that we can do through virtuous, righteous behavior here, and glimmers of hell, but that they represent something that goes, continues up and continues down in reality, which I think, Paul, what you were saying about.
Well, and both I would say have to do with the ordering of our relationships, which is what I
and
would
that's
say.
That's very Petersonian, yeah.
Which is what I would also say justice is, by the way, which is not Peterson's idea of justice. Peterson's idea of justice is it's not sufficiently relational.
Right. I agree with you 100% on that, which I think has to do a lot with his freezing of Christ as an individual first and foremost, as a righteous individual.
Well, this is also part of my problem with hell, by the way, is that in order to believe that that the destiny of all human beings is not somehow connected is to misconceive of what a person is, because we are all bound up with one another. There is actually no possibility of isolating the guilty party.
Right. Yeah.
There's no one person, not even the one person, not even the one like worst person that everybody would agree on. Let's say Hitler, right?
Yeah.
You can't, there's no way of like, okay, well, we can annihilate Hitler and that makes everything better.
Right. No.
Because because that's just simply like they're real. They're just, the monadic self just doesn't exist.
No.
Hitler had a mother. If you annihilate Hitler's existence, you are also having an impact on Hitler's mother and all of his friends and anyone who ever knew him. And you're also, there's just, it's kind of we're all in this together ultimately.
Yeah.
And I just, to me, that's like an inescapable conclusion.
I think you're bringing up kind of almost something that comes to mind anyway, is the nature of what sin might be, right? Because right now there's a big divide between people who feel that sin is this is only a collective thing, that it's in systems and all that, and then there's others who feel it's our personal shame. I don't know if this is too much of a left-hand turn, but I guess it's not hard to it's probably good to talk about sin when you talk about hell.
It's being in wrong relationship.
Yeah, and if we and I fully agree with that, and I also agree with that critique of Peterson's thinking, in that it's both and. It's our individual participation in this larger capacity to try to get more for ourselves by dehumanizing other people and by marginalizing other people and by oppressing and that kind of thing. So it's both and. Paul, you look like maybe you had thought.
Well, I think Nate and I are kind of on a spectrum. I'm more. The Bible has these the New Testament has these universalist passages that are. I mean, you find them in Gospel of John, you find them in the Book of Romans. They're just shockingly universal. And again, if you look at it, how Nate's looking at it as, in Adam, in Christ, it's one thing, but there's also individuals. And so it's
Paul, just I wonder if you're really quick, please. Okay. You're not take away the place you were born, take away your parents, take away your wife, take away your children, take away your friends. Please tell me what is left. What is Paul?
I'm not arguing that I am a series of relations, but there are things that are relating one to another. And it's not just the relationships. It is both the nouns and the verbs in the relationships. And so it's the stuff is hard to get our minds around.
But it's a kind of no thing.
But see, and there's a tension in there, because what I'm afraid of is that then we also begin to lose us, because my wife is, and my children are, and my church is, and they're not merely a relationship.
My favorite book, and you guys are both so much more well-read than I am, but my favorite book I've read on this type of issue is The Secret History of Christianity by Mark Vernon. And what it did for me was it situated Christ right in the midst of the axial age where we were transitioning, and I wish he was here to correct the words I'm going to use, but we were transitioning from a more collective, participatory, sort of located type of consciousness where we, human beings in general, didn't even really think of ourselves as individuals in the atomized sense that we're talking about now. And we were in the process of individualization, and Christ, a simplistic read would be that Christ, as Jordan Peterson would say, maybe is the ultimate righteous individual and gives us a template for the actions of a righteous individual. And yet we can also see so easily all of the negative consequences of that individualism 2,000 years later in basically, in my view, every major societal problem that we have. And so it struck me, and actually in sort of thinking about this, it struck me that Christ was in a way, I don't want to use the word template, but was an example of how to be an individual, but was also an example of how to transcend individualism and how to go beyond it, because he was clearly in submission to God, and was clearly invested knew how connected he was in the lives of the people around him. I always think of the Jesus wept verse, and you guys were you guys were getting kind of heavy there, and so if I have gone in a wrong direction, you can tell me, because
no, it's fine. No, Paul, but I mean, it's not that I think that Paul is wrong, and so, because here's the thing is, like, what I would say to Paul about what he was trying to point out is that the place where my face is held is in the person that I'm talking to. So my identity doesn't ultimately belong to me.
Right. And I think that
that's
that
the
resonates
difference
with
between
me.
an individual and a person. It's a question of who the identity belongs to.
Yeah.
And ultimately, all identities belong to Christ.
Right.
Christ is the foundation of all identity and all difference.
Right.
That's the plain meaning of John 1:1.
Say that again. Say it again. Christ
is
is
the foundation of all identity and difference.
Right. Which is a wonderful duality. Just to finish off what I was saying, I was struck last year by the Jesus wept verse when Jesus was going to heal. Was it Lazarus? Oh, Paul would know.
Yeah.
He was going to raise
Lazarus.
from
He
the
was
dead.
going to heal Lazarus, and he still wept for the pain and suffering of the one who loved Lazarus.
It's a really interesting thing to ask. Why is he weeping? He's certainly seeing the mourning around him. He sees Mary and Martha, his friends.
Right.
But that question of, well, how?
Yeah, he knows what he's going to do. So
he knows full well what he's going to do.
So that impacted me, and obviously that plus the crucifixion just shows.
Can I just
that
connects to what I was saying, because one of the explanations for why Jesus is weeping is that Jesus's own identity is not limited to just this idea of an individual self.
Right. Yeah, no,
so he is actually in that suffering of the others.
Yeah, I was kind of going there as well. It was so real to him. I can't imagine if I was on my way to heal somebody, weeping, knowing that I was about to solve the problem they were weeping about. I would be, if Jesus was the hero, as that people paint Jesus with the huge muscles, as the ultimate action hero sometimes, then that wouldn't be the case. And then I also don't think his defining act would be of dying on a cross without even physically struggling against what was happening. So there's this thing in Jesus where he was an individual submitted to God, and yet he was also just a part of reality. He was, I don't know. Go ahead. You got
and not only that, as he's being crucified, to extend his own identity to the very people who are crucifying him.
Yeah.
And identifying with them.
And but also, I mean, one of the shocking things about John 11 is, I mean, it's very clear in John 11, Jesus sets up the whole thing. He delays in order that Lazarus dies. In other words, he knows full well the suffering he is bringing upon Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Martha knows it too, because when he gets there, this passage is just astounding. She lets him have it. Hey, Jesus, if you had, and when I hear that, I think of how many dear saints in the church who have a very righteous plea to make. Lord, my loved one is dying. If you would only come near to heal them. Here in John 11, Jesus sets up the whole thing, and then he weeps. I mean, there's just so many layers to this thing.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely, I don't know how people can take their eyes off the Bible sometimes, in fact, because stories like this just.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that I would really like to reconcile this stuff about hell, because I've seen people who I
want to ask you. So tell me, So tell me what bothers you about hell, at least as you understand it, or as you understood it.
Right.
Because Nate's position, I completely understand, because we really want to see God win. And in that sense, full reconciliation is God winning. And but so then talk to me about hell as you knew it, and what sort of brings this up for you.
Right. So, I mean, what bothers me about hell is and like, it's not what bothers me about the hell that I believe. Like, okay, I'll back up and say this a different way. I have the intuition that there is a version of hell that I can live with, and one where, okay, what bothers me about the hell that I was raised with was the obsession with belief, as you already mentioned, Nate, that it is about believing and affirming and having faith in particular propositional knowledge. And I think what really scared me was, as I was unraveling, it became very clear to me how little I control
losing what you needed to
belief.
get out of hell.
Yeah. Well, I exactly, and how little I was able to control my beliefs. And I think I even mentioned this, Paul, in our last conversation. What I had an image in my mind of a velvet bag, and my beliefs were in that velvet bag, and I could reach into the bag and feel around at the shape of my beliefs, and I could look at the effect that my beliefs have on my behavior. But putting something in the bag was not really an option. And so here I was, at that time, I had a couple of kids and a wife, and our whole life was built on the foundation that we affirm the same things. We were never fire and brimstone couple, and I wasn't really worried. My wife's very rational and caring, and she wasn't about to, cast me out for my newfound beliefs. But I would have, at that time, I thought, if I could just get back to where I agreed I was when we got married, that would probably be best for my immediate life. And I just can't do it. I knew that it was impossible to do it. And at that time, I thought I was becoming an atheist. But at the very least, that I was realizing that I had no direct control. My beliefs, like, I had been told that I have control over my beliefs, just believe, and even Nate on Twitter the other day, you said your policy is believe it all. And we kind of got into a little bit of thing, believe it all when it comes to the I think we were talking about Catholic doctrines or something. Anyway, and I thought, well, that sounds great. I just don't know.
No, I was actually talking about mythology.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I sorry, and I don't remember exactly.
That's something that Peugeot and I have in common, and I've been that way. I mean, I wanted to be a mythologist. I saw Joseph Campbell for the first time when I was a teenager, and it's like I was already obsessed with mythology even before that, but then once I found Joseph Campbell, it was like,
yeah. Well, I think that's one of those things that's coming back in, and into favor. And there's a lot of conversation about mythology. So we could go on a mythology detour, or we could go on a response to.
There's actually a meaningful detour here, because I think a lot of the eternal conscious torment vision of hell actually is an import from paganism. It doesn't. It doesn't exist in Judaism. It just doesn't. We didn't get that from the Jews. We got that. We definitely got that from the pagans. Jews are almost entirely universalists, with some rare exceptions. And they also don't have. Because the emphasis in the Jewish religious life is on the performance of mitzvah, they don't have the same problem with beliefism that we do either.
Right. That's a fascinating point. Man, there's so many roads, so many roads. Paul, you look like you might be having a thought you want to say, and then I'll try and tie it together.
When I was listening to you talk about your crisis, let's call it that, because you begin to realize that, oh my goodness, within this framework, my get out of hell free card is contingent upon mental assent to the things in this box. That's very common. It's been around a long time, but it was absolutely never as simple as that. Because, and I've watched certain, I don't think the Christian Reformed Church quite were, at least the religion that I inherited from my father and my father's church didn't quite believe even that, even though a lot of people might have said it did. For example, I remember listening to, these were Baptists, I remember listening to them talk about a former preacher who had cheated on his wife and run off with another woman in the church. And I remember at least these people talking about whether or not, because they were sort of Reformed Baptist, and then they have all of these like once saved, always saved. That's not
we can all agree that once saved, always saved Baptists are wrong.
Well, in the Christian Reformed Church, we always had perseverance of the saints, which I thought was, that's a much better way of once saved, always saved. And so then they're talking about this preacher who ran off with this woman, and they're saying, well, did he lose his salvation? As if this salvation was something completely disconnected from running off with this other woman. Now, because he had all of these, it's like he had all of these little beliefs in this little box, and that was, shot up to heaven in this little vacuum tube. So, well, there's his ticket. He had his ticket. Yeah. So once he had his ticket up, then he could run off with this other woman.
He's in the spreadsheet now. There's right. a check in the box for saved.
And, even just as a young kid, you look at this and you begin to say, oh, wait a minute. If this isn't the easiest game to fix. Now, I don't want to be too flippant with all of that, because there is a lot more going on. But for many people with sort of that extremely low resolution view, at some point you have to look at that world and say, okay, this is what you think the way it works. Now, maybe read your Bible a little bit and realize that, when you talked about, so realized eschatology is something very much within my theological framework, but realized eschatology happens with respect to this other really fancy word that's very popular in this little corner, participation. And when you listen to Paul say these extraordinary things about this group of sinners in 1 Corinthians, one minute he says, the way you guys behave, there's nothing Christian about you. And then he turns around a minute and says, you have been raised with Christ Jesus and are practically seated in the heavenlies. And it's like, well, how does any of this work? And so, the process you went through, which many, many people are going through this process, I think lends something to Nate's point about the limits of our individuality. When this whole community finds themselves deconstructing, they're not doing it alone. And that's because in some ways, this larger body is changing. Yeah. And so suddenly you realize you as an individual, my gosh, I'm not in control of what I believe. I thought I had everything squared up in that little box. If I could go back to that little box, then everything would be great. There's no going back.
Right. That
was clear. And so now you're on a road where, the questions are going to get harder. And I think this is maturation, both in terms of you, but also in terms of the community, hopefully maturation into which will be for the community, perhaps something new, but also hopefully something that is also very old. Because what happened specifically in the shaping of American evangelicalism, Mark Knoll writes about this well, the population got way out ahead of the churches, which, well, there were some good things to that. There was a little bit of freedom. But there's also some bad things because a whole bunch of other stuff that the churches kind of held got lost. And so some of these other things kind of emerged, but you knew they weren't going to last too long because they're just not coherent enough to be too stable. And I think that's part of the reason why suddenly people are discovering church fathers church tradition, lots
Orthodoxy.
of old ways of talking. And so in that sense, the church is catching up to the pioneers, and it's a good thing.
So I think, taking some things out of what you're saying there, there's this sense of the new, there's this sense of of my journey, my journey of Christianity, and I've actually wondered, in that my journey of Christianity often rejects just out of hand traditions and long held church beliefs and liturgy and all those kinds of things, and so it's this kind of awkward situation where I think in modern times and in modernist times and times strongly influenced by American Christianity, it seems to me that when people leave the church and leave the faith, they don't leave the underlying thinking that was there, and they begin to, I felt a temptation, and I saw other people beginning to now preach another thing. And so people would maybe go on the same route that I was going with something like hell and say, well, I don't believe in hell now, so I'm going to boldly preach that hell doesn't exist and that there's no punishment and that we're all good and everything like that. And that felt very wrong to me too. It felt like
I would agree.
It felt like playing the same.
That's wrong too.
It felt like playing the same game. You know what I mean? Like it felt like I was using all of the same weapons that had been used against me against other people in a weird way. So what I felt, and again, this was all precipitated by a very specific moment and a very impactful spiritual experience I had, where I was hit like a ton of bricks by the passage, "Go from your father's house to the land that I will show you." That's not a perfect, but it was to, you know the verse. And what I decided to, and I'm not trying to self-aggrandize here. I actually really did feel like there was something I was being called to do from outside myself and protected while doing. And that was to actually enter, I'm calling it now, kind of a spiritual space where I had very few things. Whereas instead of being in an established settlement, I had a backpack. I was a bit of a nomad. I didn't have very many things in the backpack. If you asked me what I believed, they were really simple things, and not very many of them. And just probably, not even religious, just things about loving my family. And I thought, well, if I'm going to go on this road,
not religious.
Well, I mean, you know what I mean? Like it seemed like it wasn't. It was a natural thing. And I thought, well, if I go down this road and I love my family less, if I'm being less good to my family, then I'm on the wrong road, that kind of thing. And I guess I'm thinking that it's very difficult for people to travel light these days. And I'm trying to bring this in a good direction. I guess there's a lot of people who have kind of changed their faith, but not changed kind of I don't know. Okay, I'm losing. I'm running out of steam. Does one of you guys have a response to what I'm saying?
I would point out how little we've talked about hell.
Yeah,
and I think that's a good thing, because the point is talking about the Christian life. The point is union with Christ.
There's a great Thomas Merton essay. It's called "The Moral Theology of the Devil." And it's really, that's kind of I would recommend it to you, Aaron. I think you'll enjoy it.
The moral theology.
And that's kind of what's it about. It's about how focusing too much on that kind of thing ends up undoing you.
Right.
Let's give hell its due now, because as a pastor, sometimes the reason people come to pastors these days is because a bottom has fallen out of something. And so someone comes to me and they have made a mess of their family. They have made a mess of their life. They have screwed people all up and down their relational network. And they come and they have a sense that they are in mortal danger of hell. And that is exactly what they should be feeling. And that is exactly when you wade in with the gospel, with this outrageous claim that despite all of the catastrophe that they have left in their wake, intentionally or unintentionally, that Jesus Christ can rescue them from themselves. And, there's the gospel. And, again, the point isn't, oh, you're walking into this thing and I'm going to scare you into becoming a church member by, talking about how angry God is with you. Even if you read Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, people hear about that thing all the time. And I would really challenge people to read it. Now, it's a little difficult to read in some ways because the puritanical, the context is a little different from us. But I remember you'd hear about that sermon all the time, and I read it, and I thought, that sermon doesn't play in me like it sounds like it plays in all kinds of other people. And so, people are told to go out there and preach the good news. And it almost seems that people don't know what the good news is. And part of the reason is that because hell is pretty darn common around us.
Right. And there is
but Christ arrows it.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't lose sight of that.
There is a language to talk about hell, and Thomas Merton is great for speaking on ways that things that can be taken in multiple levels. Where, when we talk about hell, what probably is most pressing in the people you're talking about, Paul, is the hell that they've created on earth, and they have an intuition that as above, so below, or as like that these things compound, these things get, there's something even worse than what's happening now, and I want to stop before we get there, kind of thing. And it actually, what came to my mind when you were saying that was how often, in a weird way, church described sin as actually kind of fun. I've heard many times, like there was
some sin is really fun. Let's be frank.
But all right, but there was a tweet a while back that got a lot of traction. People liked to laugh at it, where this pastor guy was saying, if Christ didn't physically rise from the dead, I'm at the orgy tomorrow. And the idea in that kind of thing, and like he was trying to make a mic drop point. He wasn't saying that he's actually going to go. He was saying that this was our hedge against sin, but sin is often described as something that is fun, and I think, and that we deny ourselves this fun in life so that we can have fun in heaven, or something like that. And so
I think there's a way I could steel man what he was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you could, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think to make what he was saying very succinct, I don't think what he was saying was all that different from what David Bentley Hart says in his Christ or Nothing essay. Like, it's like, if you're really honest about what the options are on the table, and so that's what he's expressing. It's like, if I cannot find truth in the person of Christ, that is the truth, is the person of Christ. If I cannot find truth in the person of Christ, then there is no truth at all. Nothing means anything, so I might as well distract myself with pleasures until I die. Right. I think that's so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no,
I'm with him on that.
Yeah,
I probably wouldn't say like physically resurrect, or like that's a little bit too narrow way of construing the resurrection. But he's still fundamentally right.
Right. Yeah, no, I can see that. I wasn't, I didn't want to draw too much attention, or I didn't want to, but my point about saying that tweet was that there's this weird, pious, uncomfortable moralism that people tend to have when it is seen as death is this death is a cutoff after which, if you did bad stuff in this life, you're there. It's like the two elevators, and it seems very, like very simplistic, as Paul was saying earlier. But I'm getting a thread coming through things, and I'd like to move towards in a certain direction, which is, Paul, earlier you said that we've compressed everything into this life, and we don't give much thought to before life or after life. And it seems to me that for many people, including some people who probably consider themselves to be a Christian, we are quite focused on this life, and I think understandably so. And to begin to think about what happens after this life is to kind of painfully reopen a book that people feel is closed. So I'm wondering, like, I feel that it's useful to reopen the book about life after death, even though on a personal level, I haven't become settled on what I think happens after death. But when we want to talk about mythology, the mythology of the Bible has such a compelling internal logic to me that I still call myself a Christian. I still feel I am a Christian. I love Jesus Christ. And I take a lot of the Bible mythologically, not because I think it's not referring to real truth or that it's just an allegory, but it's mythological in the sense that it is describing greater reality in ways that are layered and ways that are evocative and imagistic and full of the imagination instead of simply historical. And so I guess
The Gospels don't read that way, though. I mean, they just don't. I mean,
right, sure.
They don't read like. I mean, if you're talking about the early chapters of Genesis, do they read like mythology? Yes, they do. They read like mythology. They have a similar structure to mythology. They resemble mythology, and it resembles mythology in many ways. But that's not, the Gospels aren't structured that way. And so the Bible is like, it's a text that has lots of different types of genres of literature in it. So I don't think we can like universally like make treat the entire Bible as mythology. Are there parts of the Bible that have a mythological character and are speaking truths that are similar to mythological truths? Yes, that's definitely true. But that's not the entirety.
Right. Fair enough. I guess I wasn't attempting to say that the Bible is only mythology, but that, oh man. And so, this is where people will, in the comments on this video, I'll get the most grief, because I know
there'll be
no, be honest. Here. It's fine. It's fine.
Even the life of Jesus, and the Gospels, I know they're not written in a mythological style, but I think that the way that I'm kind of processing them is mythological.
You know what they remind me of in terms of their literary style? The thing that I've read in my life that reminds me the most of the way the Gospels are written are the Scandinavian sagas, because they have the same sort of blunt matter-of-factness and the same like lack of any attempt to do any kind of discursive reasoning.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think, when you were talking about a big part of trying to figure out Christianity and the way we get it wrong often is to try to figure out this life and even what is life. I mean, when Paul says your life is hidden with Christ in the heavens, it's like, What does that mean?
Yeah.
And
He might be saying that you're not merely a monadic self. I'm just suggesting.
Heyo. So,
but the, because often, especially in the kinds of Christian places that you were just describing, sometimes, let's call it, the afterlife is used to sort of demote the significance of our behavior here and now. I don't see that at all in the Bible. It's a really interesting negotiation in terms of the life that we're living now and the life that we continue on living.
Right.
And it's not at all easy to just sort of put on the table as such.
Right.
But we continue to work that through, partly just because life itself is just so unbelievably strange. And the more we seem to learn, part of this whole little corner is cognitive science and perception and the strangeness of that. Right. Part of what's happened as we get out of the modern world is that, this all just isn't quite as flat as we thought it was.
Yeah, and situating ourselves within the eternal can be a really important step. And I wasn't trying to say, I wasn't defending in any way the way that I am currently experiencing the scriptures. What I was getting at was that there are layers and there are levels and there are various ways to that we experience the Bible. I don't even want to say that we're always able to choose which way that we do that. But like as I talked with Paul in our last conversation about the historicity of the Bible and the resurrection, there is that concrete element, and there are parts of the Bible that are clearly referring to, real historical events and situating themselves in history. And I guess what I would love to do is to re-enchant the Bible and re-enchant Christianity. This is, we're just going to say some very, very lofty things with this kind of expectation and even a joy in seeing it unfold in various ways. Whereas, where we're not necessarily saying the way that I've experienced this right now is always the way it should be, and looking at the experiences of people, looking at people who believe in 100% in historical accuracy of the Bible, and saying there is something that person is receiving from this that I may not receive in the same way, and just respecting the various different experiences of the Bible and experiences of Scripture, and when I say re-enchanting, I just mean being okay with great mystery in the faith and in the afterlife, but not putting a huge pressure on ourselves to definitively say there is no hell or things like that. Conversations about Christianity always get me into these very rambly states. Looks like Nate maybe has a response.
Originally I wanted to say something about judgment, but we kind of sidetracked it. We kind of got away from that, so I won't go back to that. But I did wanted to say something about how we tend to think about judgment quantitatively as human beings, and I don't think God necessarily thinks about judgment in the same quantitative way that we do. Like I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway because I think it will be useful, and then I can connect this to the afterlife. So I'll connect this to the afterlife thing.
Do it.
So we kind of, like, to me, the way human beings tend to think about judgment, it seems like we're still thinking of it in basically an Egyptian way, where it's like they're the balancing of the good deeds and the bad deeds on a like a completely quantitative thought about judgment. But there's this idea within that I've heard from certain Jewish thinkers that I really like, is that, like, God may have put you here on this earth to have one conversation with one person at one time. That may be the entire reason that God brought you into being. So you don't really know what the basis of God's judgment of you is. So this is why I say it's like you should definitely be agnostic about your own status when it comes to being judged by God, because you really have no idea. And I've always been like really, really intrigued by like characters that like seem to be like bad characters, but then it's like they in a crucible moment they do something that it just completely like defies expectation.
Yeah.
Like Sidney Carton in Tale of Two Cities, right? Who's just a terrible person, but then ends up giving up his life to save someone who is nobler and better than he is.
Or Billy in Stranger Things. I don't know if you guys have watched Stranger
Yeah,
Things.
exactly. Yes. No, yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. So I think we find those stories compelling. And I think those stories are hinting at how God judges as compared to the kind of like quantitative balance way that we tend to. So I wanted to say that. And so I think that does play into the question of the afterlife. And then for me, it's like, I've never doubted it in my adult life that there is some kind of life after death, because I almost died when I was 14 years old. I went into respiratory arrest and almost died from an asthma attack. And the experience was one of like terror and panic. And then right before the paramedics got there, I just had like this sense of, I am going to die. All will be okay. Like that. And that's it. It was like that was the extent of the revelations. Like, I am going to die, and I did not die in that moment, of course, but the fact that I am going to die is true. This is the thing that's interesting about resurrection. And the fact that we pretend that we understand resurrection is pretty fun. We have no idea.
just listen to Nate's conversation with Chris Green and Jordan if you want to see where resurrection goes.
Because we don't understand the meaning of our own death, and resurrection necessarily, like, it's not resurrection without death. Like, death is involved in resurrection.
Right.
And so, yeah. I don't pretend to know what the meaning of it is, but I know that. But I trust. I have faith that there's something.
And the bottom of our faith. I mean, this is the most radical claim I think Christians make today.
Yes,
which is completely overlooked, is that God is good, and can be trusted.
Yes.
And, and so one of the quick things I do with people is, so I'll swap in, because people get nervous about the word God. So being with a capital B, is being good, neutral, or evil? And when I hear someone say being is good, I think, boy, you're not too far off. You better be careful, because that is a radical thing, that sort of the contemporary, the mythology of the world that says, being is at best neutral. No, Christians say, no, God is good.
Yeah.
And it's trusted.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you guys are saying. I feel like there's gotta be a religious a Christian way to live life that isn't nihilistic. I do worry a little bit, I understand what you mean. I think when you say, Nate, that, we might be on this earth for one conversation. We don't really know how God's going to judge us, because I guess I've just experienced a lot of people who are always trying to identify God's judgment in their lives, and they want to say, the most extreme example would be Greensboro Baptist Church saying that basically all the problems that we have in America are because we've tolerated homosexuals or something like that. Where we really want to pinpoint God's judgment and say what it's going to be. And I guess the thing that worries me is, if I thought maybe I was in this life for one conversation, I might. I mean, obviously, we don't know that. We can't say that. And so I just don't want to be in that position of being like, well, maybe everything I'm doing right now is of no importance, because I'm not at that place yet where it's time for me to do what I'm on the earth to do, what God will judge me if I don't do. And I think I'll know it when it happens. But right now, it's just kind of, I'm in this kind of meh zone or something like that. And so I guess yeah. Do you have a response?
Yeah,
to
well, yeah, that judge not lest you be judged thing gets abused a lot. And I think what that's talking about is judging beings. We don't get to, as human beings, we don't get to judge beings. That's up to God to judge beings. But in terms of like, we can't live in the world without exercising our faculty of judgment. It can't
Right.
mean that.
Right.
So, and I would say in the case of the Westboro Baptist Church, they probably are erring toward judging beings.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, no, it just might be.
If you want to judge our actions, that's fine. But how about you? But judgment of beings, that's God's job.
I just thought, Nate, that when you said that about here for one thing, I could just imagine so many people. Have I done the thing yet? Did I miss it? I mean, people get paranoid about.
Yeah,
it's the same thing with the unforgivable sin. I mean, that'll be one of the things I sit down with Jesus and say, that unforgivable sin thing. That a lot of people kind of went off in some different directions.
There was a lot of neuroses on that. Yeah. So
it's actually one of the most common concerns amongst paranoid schizophrenics is having
really
yes yeah.
So I guess what the type of Christian life that I would like to have is one of great patience, where not that it isn't active, but that like if you'd asked me to describe where I would hope my life would go and where I would hope my faith would be at 42, I would probably describe something a lot different than a guy who's begging friends on the internet to explain hell to him, and yet I'm not upset with my life. I'm not. I'm happy with my path. I feel situated in the present, and I think that my feeling of being situated in the present comes from having lost a lot of my fear of hell around the corner, of like when death comes, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the end of me forever. And I feel like that when that went away, I'm not saying that I've reached a conclusion, but when I realized I didn't believe in hell, I felt like I was sort of looking around and kind of seeing people, like my children are hugely formative for me on this, because I couldn't do the thing where I tried to make sure that they were saved in this kind of final way, because what I wanted them to do was to be growing towards where they needed to be without the threat of a huge punishment. And so
one of the things that has bugged me about Protestants, I mean, Protestants spend a lot of time pointing fingers at Catholics and Jews, talking about works righteousness and legalism. And in these churches, I mean, they have this tiny little box and it's all their little legalisms. And it's like, well, if you don't do this, then off to hell you go. And it's like, wait a minute. I thought that was the problem. I thought that was the problem with the Catholics and the Jews, and you're playing the same game. So your children very much will learn about reward and punishment. That's just sort of a regular thing that you pick up when you get in your 2s, 3s, 4s and your grade school. I think I think part of what, when I see people deconstruct, part of what I often think they will probably regret later on is when they're too hard on the people that they are rebelling against.
Right.
Because again, even in kind of your very, let's say, a stereotypical Baptist-y, non-denominational church, go into almost any church like that, you're going to find some saints. You can have all kinds of problems with this and that and legalisms and hypocrisies and judgmentalisms and narrow-mindedness, but son of a gun, if you don't wind up finding some saints in that place.
Right.
And you'll find this all over the place. And you'll find churches where there's not enough saints. That's absolutely true too. But God is remarkably generous, even with our own little petty narrownesses and stupidities. And, I think our children, you definitely want to give your children the best Christian theological inheritance you can. And I think it's in that light that you should see a lot of this new thinking and evolution and desire. You want to give your children the best things you can. And,
Well,
the system you come up with will be shitty in its own way. Trust me, mine certainly is. And
Right.
your kids will probably find that shittiness at some point, rebel against it. You should
Yeah.
hope your kids get beyond
right.
you, but
yeah.
this is all part of the process.
But I guess there's a little bit of clarity happening here, which I know is strange to hear from me, but and that is that of all the things that I just don't think I could tell my children, it is simply that there's a chance of eternal punishment if they don't get something right. I can understand the idea of telling them that there'll be a severe punishment, maybe even eternal, if they truly give themselves over in a way that I've never seen a single human being do to evil. You know what I mean? So I would like to be able to discuss the afterlife with my children without eternal pain and suffering being on the table. And I know that Nate would share that. And Paul, do you feel that there is an eternal punishment on the table, or do you just not feel qualified to answer that, or what do you think of that?
Here's an irony. Your children, especially if they're like in single digits age, are going to have a sense of eternal judgment and condemnation for maybe some really bad things like lying and stealing. They are going to feel that inside of them.
Yeah.
If you want to look at moralistic creatures, look at fifth graders. I mean, they are right and there is wrong, and it is always right and it is always wrong. This is a function of how we work. Now, and this is why I'm not a I don't know. I mean, part of it is this is where I'm Protestant, because when I read the Bible, I can't get to eternal reconciliation. I can see where it's in there, and I think maybe, and then there's other pieces that are like, and so it's like, okay, Lord, I'm going to go with the package that I got, and I'm going to trust you for the rest. But that's always the way it is, even for the fifth grader. You finally, the baseline condition is God is good. He's going to do what's right. And what my little framework in my mind, we just finished saying we're not finally judged by all of our little frameworks in our mind. And you know what's included in that? This whole idea, whether it's eternal, whether it's universal reconciliation or not. That finally, just like judging beings, is God's business. And how God finally resolves the story of human rebellion, that's God's. Now, there's lots of images that I see in Scripture that suggest the question is there a remainder? And what happens to that remainder? And again, just with that little table, some see annihilation, others see universal reconciliation, others see a place of judgment. But it's also important to remember that eternal does not simply equal forever. Those are not exactly the same things.
That's right. That is absolutely right. 100% right. In fact, Berdyaev has a great line about this, where he points out that eternity is by nature, because it's connected with the infinity of God, is by nature not a quantitative concept.
Right.
Mm.
And
that's why eternal conscious torment, that's a new phrase. And when I heard it for the first time, I thought, now we're playing games.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I like this Yeah.
Yeah, so I think for he's right to say that forever is a different thing from eternal. Because forever is when you talk about forever, you're conceptualizing infinite duration. It's which gets us all into all kinds of other things about the nature of time. And here's what I would say to Paul. This is what I want to say to Paul. This is actually, I think what we need to do is not obsess with agreeing over the answers to these questions. Right? So we need to get
Agreed.
because he's right to say that trusting God is the bottom line. Yeah. And my belief is based on the fact that I just trust that God is better than I am, and that His judgment is wiser than my judgment.
Right.
Right. So, and His mercy is greater than my mercy. So,
and this is so true. And
His judgments are harsher than mine too.
But
it goes both ways.
Yeah,
more just,
terrifying,
harsher, but
wonderful.
more harsher, but more just. Because when it's funny, I never was able to call God Father. I still have a hard time in prayer saying Father. It's one of those things I'm in process with, but I feel like becoming a father gave me some glimpses. You want to talk about, a natural inclination in children to think about eternal punishment. Well, there's a natural thing that happens in me as a father when I've messed up, to know that this was not God. This was not how God would have handled this situation. To just know, even if I can forgive myself for it, that God would not have simply lashed out in fruitless anger, because it seems to me that God doesn't do anything that is fruitless. That doesn't. I don't know how to describe exactly what I'm saying, but I can relate to God now in the sense of I can see very clearly where I'm not fully just, and it is very hard for me to imagine a justice that would involve forever punishment. But I like this idea of the eternal not equating to forever. Not that I'm in a big hurry to define definitively what eternal even means, because that's
really hard for us too.
Yeah, it's hard to do, but I guess I guess I do feel that we're in a reality characterized by a God who is good, and by a justice that is never without purpose.
But it's helpful to remember when you think about your children, they're children. I mean, this dominant relational framework that Jesus really sets up and gives us of fathers and children. Your children are the developmental age they are, and they're going to view you, and they're going to view good, bad, right, and wrong, and they're going to view all of that structure through that. And all of this nuance, as you view their structure, having actually passed through that, it's going to be lost to them because they're just in that place. But this is the same thing for us. And when you begin to recognize our own limitations, and you begin to look at the mythology, the symbolism, all of the ways that we try to conceptualize the life of the age to come, if you really start thinking about it, you begin to realize we have symbols, we have mythology, we have all of this. But when I was 12, even a 12-year-old, even with all of the information I had about human beings, I had no idea what it was going to be like to be a 40-year-old father. I was a 12-year-old.
Right.
And we're still in that. And so then the question is, our little controllers inside get all anxious, but it's like, do you trust God or not? Is he good? And if so, just like your child trusts you, or hopefully, to the degree that they probably do quite a bit. This is our posture towards God.
Right. We become a stand-in for God, and for them, I think, kind of they can't really imagine the real God, just as I can't really imagine a real God, but they have this person there. And I guess what strikes me as the goal, to get back to the interconnection of everyone, is that when we speak to anyone about hell, or when we speak to our children about punishment or whatever, the main thing is to be present with them and to be really looking at them and to be willing to bear suffering with them here and now.
Well, Aaron, think about like this. Actually, this is part of why I have the position that I have too. Think about when you punish your children. Why do you punish your children? Do you punish your children for retribution, or do you punish your children
Sometimes,
for their benefit?
but hopefully not.
For their benefit, right?
When you do, you know it's wrong.
If you're a good parent, then you're punishing them to in a restorative way. You're exercising restorative justice and not retributive. I mean, there's otherwise you're a terrible parent. So I just assume that God is not a terrible parent.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's also I would say it's also the case that, and so that frames pretty well when the child is small. But when you have a relationship with an adult child, and then you're in a little different relationship too, because you're sort of a parent, you're not really a parent, and because there is in families exile. Right. And I think finally most of the images I see from Jesus about hell are exile and distance. But then you have the question, can that gulf be traversed? And I think that's where a lot of these conversations, where they go. And I don't know that we can answer that question as we are. I'm just not as optimistic as others.
I do feel that it's, if you're exiling a family member, like a grown child, there is always that recognition that the exile is not permanent from your end. You know what I mean? Like it isn't that you. I would hope. It's hard for me to imagine a situation where I could exile my adult child
if
in a way that
had a parable that was exactly applicable to this situation.
No, and we were talking the prodigal son, right?
But we talked about McDonald. Let's talk about Lewis in The Great Divorce, because Lewis, you see Lewis playing with these questions in The Great Divorce. And, one of the things that he says is, at what point does someone who grumbles just become a grumble? Not a person who grumbles, but just a grumble. And now, is that an annihilationist position? I mean, there's also a sense in which in sin, this stuff is really hard to get at, but that's why that's why the Christian church has been talking about this stuff for 2 millennia and has not been able to arrive at consensus.
So Lewis is really interesting in The Great Divorce because he's kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
The way I would describe Lewis's position in The Great Divorce is, I would say that he's a pessimistic universalist.
That's a probably pretty good description.
Because, and I mean, Jesus is the bus driver.
Yep.
I mean, so.
But there's night coming to the city.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I think it's a pretty good. I mean, but that's what Lewis is wrestling with these things.
Yeah,
and
he is.
That's
and I
think
think McDonald is what forces him to wrestle with it.
I always get that wrestling from Lewis as well. In The Great Divorce, hell is. I mean, he's not saying this is what hell really is, but hell is the fulfillment of our sinful desires.
Notice. By the way, here's the thing. This is what I really like about Lewis in The Great Divorce. It's very clear that the people that are in hell in The Great Divorce exist solely as monadic selves. That's why they're in these houses all by themselves with everything they ever wanted, but they're still miserable.
They get what they want, but they're miserable.
So they're failing to be what they were created to be because they're insisting on believing that they exist as a monadic self.
Right. And then you've got the last battle where, Narnia is being destroyed, and you've got all of the creatures who weren't submitted to Aslan running through a black doorway, and they're never seen again. But then you've also got the Calamine wandering in a daze around heaven, because when he was looking for Tash, he was looking for Aslan, kind of thing. And so yeah, I mean, I guess my favorite thinkers and speakers and writers on this do always seem to have this tension that won't let them quite preach the brimstone and the fire and the brimstone. I mean, yourself included, Paul. You're not a fire
And that's sometimes a fault of mine. The whole Winsome War thing going on in evangelicalism. I think we sometimes don't own up to just how deadly and destructive sin is. And I think part of, the whole line, these things are too wonderful for me. And we say wonderful, we shouldn't mean it in a Disneyland thing. But the fact that, number one, I think we went to Lewis in The Great Divorce. Well, I brought him up, but partly because narrative tends to afford more resolution and nuance and ambiguity than just sort of statements of the categories that we're in. And also, and because this is what we see in life. I mean, truth, no matter how much good fiction we seem to write, what happens around us continues to sort of outdo it. And I think that the real confidence that we can have as Christians is that, to what degree, whatever difference there is between Nate and myself with respect to this, God is going to do better than anything Nate or I can really sort of conceptualize and do. And so that however God resolves all of this, it for us will be delight and surprise and wonderment, in that even when God is doing it, we probably won't be able to wrap our minds around just how good he's doing it. And that kind of optimism should be what energizes our trust in God and the Christian faith. And so that's what we must lean into.
That was a good, I feel like that was a good closer in some ways. Nate, do you have responses to that?
I think that's fantastic. I have no objection to that.
Yeah.
I think that just echoes what I said earlier about, like, it's like we can't let our positions on these kinds of things divide us. We really can't, because they're ultimately our positions. Yeah. And we can make the best argument that we can for them, but we don't know them for sure. There's Valentin Tomberg, who's an author whose book I've been handling on my channel.
Did you send that book to me? Because, if my members of the congregation come in and see this thing about tarot in their pastor's office, I'm going to be in trouble.
It has nothing to do with
I
divination.
Understand, but
it's a book on symbolism, actually. It's a book on symbolism. But yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it's the kind of title that freaks people out, but it really has nothing to do with divination, and it's all about symbolism. But he has these categories of people who are Greek, right? Who are Greek, who can be like, they can argue too forcefully for universalism in such a way that they seem to be making a demand on God. And he also has this category of people that are Hebrews, in that they can make they can make the same kind of demands about the justice of God, and that both of those things are in error. And Tomberg,
disrespectful.
Tomberg actually affirms both eternal hell in that sense that Berdyaev means it, where it's not a quantitative thing, but it's a qualitative thing. And that essentially, he that enters into eternity without an ounce of love experiences eternal hell. That's just what happens when you enter eternity without an ounce of love.
That's a great
and at the same time,
he
he holds to universal reconciliation, thereby holding these two halves of what we see in the scripture together.
I love that. I feel like both of your guys' monologues that you just did are really great. And I feel like this is the kind of conversation that in the modern world is so frustrating to people who want an answer
Yeah.
You know, someone who would watch this video, and I think I'm just spiritual enough that I haven't found it frustrating, that I kind of love it, and that I realize it's kind of the nature of these things is that we are working with them. We're bringing them alongside us in our journey through life. We're, you know, these are the things that we evolve with and grow with, and that you're absolutely right that there's kind of a disrespect or a lack of seriousness in demanding, you know, in demanding particular conclusions from God, in reading the scriptures and seeing our experiences in life, and still saying that we must, you know, definitively answer this.
But we both did give you a definitive answer, and the same one. Trust the person of Christ, trust God.
Yeah.
That's the definitive answer we both gave.
And anybody who gives you a hard time from your church, just start singing "Jesus is the answer for the world today." Because there, it's right there in the song. It's
well, I go to an Anglican church now, and I don't get a lot. I don't.
You won't sing that song there.
I divested. I got out of the system I was in before. But yeah. Anyway,
just lean into those Wesleyan hymns.
I love the Anglican Book of Common Praise. There's a few in there that just slay me. The theology in there.
We have great hymns.
Yeah, you're an Anglican as well, right? Yep. That's right. So yeah, Nate and Paul, I appreciate this conversation very much, and I appreciate you, weeding through what I'm trying to say and what I'm, my questions that aren't questions. There's so much to chew on here. I'm gonna be thinking about this. I love the trust the person of Christ. I love the eternal isn't a quantitative measurement. Yeah, lots of great stuff. So I guess we'll end there, and I'll say thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I'm
always game to talk to you.
Yeah,
as long as I have time.
We'll do it again. I've had to call a spade a spade. When I started this podcast, it was not going to be a Christian podcast, damn it. So I've talked to Satanists, I've talked to a couple of porn performers and things like that. But damn it, this is where I'm at now. So we're going to be wrestling with Christian issues here, and I really appreciate your time, and I'll probably be asking you again at some point in the future.
All right, Aaron.